Hi, my name is Tom Lyon. I'm a professor of law and psychology at the University of Southern California. And this training is called Interviewing Children, Getting More with Less. What I'll be doing is teaching you a 10-step protocol, a protocol for interviewing young kids that's based on research. It was designed for talking to kids about sexual abuse, but I've used it, and it's very usable, for children in all sorts of witnessing situations, such as domestic violence exposure, witnessing to homicide, exposure to drug abuse, and physical abuse. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. When I got out of law school, I immediately went to work for County Council in Los Angeles County, and I represented the Department of Children and Family Services in dependency cases, cases in which children were removed from their home because of abuse and neglect. One of the things I quickly learned was that my law school training didn't train me for the job, because although I understood the legal technicalities of what I was doing, I had no idea on how to appropriately interact with the most important witnesses in the case, the children involved. After doing this, struggling with this for a couple of years, I went back to school in developmental psychology and obtained a PhD in research. Since then, I've continued to do research with children, many of them in child abuse court, to understand the best means of questioning children. Now, most of what I'll talk about is not research that I've done. In fact, most of it was produced by researchers at the National Institute of Child Health and Development, who developed a structured protocol for interviewing kids. My 10-step is just a simpler version, something that I think is easy to retain, easy to take with you, and that's something that I'll be teaching you about today. I want to also thank several agencies that have helped by providing tapes, advice, and input into the training that I'm going to be presenting today, although of course, they don't endorse any of the specific ideas. Children's Advocacy Center in Pomona, California, the Violence Intervention Program at LAC-USC Medical Center, and also the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. They've all been extremely helpful in providing tapes of interviews, some of which I've conducted, in order to help show you the best techniques for interviewing children. The problem with interviewing is that we too often rely on our experience rather than on research. The protocol that I'm going to present today is research-based. Everything I'm going to teach you has been supported by some kind of systematic investigation of what works best in questioning young children. The problem with experience is that we don't know for sure what actually happened to a child. So our experience may teach us that a certain type of investigative interview reliably increases disclosures, but we don't know if those disclosures are true. And the daycare disasters of the 1980s and 1990s were cases in which interviewers had found techniques that reliably increased the number of children disclosing abuse, but unfortunately also increased the likelihood that children would report abuse that was bizarre or satanic or simply highly improbable. And it was because of those cases that the credibility of children is now often undermined in cases where they probably were abused. Because experience is not always a good teacher, because research is a proven teacher, I'm going to be talking about research-based practice, research-proven techniques for improving the quality of children's reports. Here's what we're going to do today. First, we're going to start with a case study. This is an actual case of child sexual abuse tried in criminal court, the case of Catherine and Alexis. The problems that we see in that case are really quite typical of child witnesses in general. Not just criminal cases, but cases in dependency court and family court. Not just child sexual abuse, but also domestic violence, other types of family violence like witnessing to homicide, children's exposure to drug abuse, neglect cases. Any case where a child is a witness, these problems will occur. We'll then talk about the important issue of question types, the distinctions among different types of questions, and the problems with using closed-ended questions rather than open-ended questions in questioning kids. We'll then look at the 10-step interview. As I mentioned before, this is an interview that I developed, but is really just based on the National Institute of Child Health and Development structured protocol for interviewing children. It includes narrative instructions, narrative practice, the disclosure phase, or we might say the allegation phase, and follow-ups. This is the case of Catherine and Alexis, an actual sexual abuse prosecution that occurred in California a few years ago. Both girls were 9 years of age. They were the daughter and niece of the defendant's girlfriend, and both girls testified that the defendant molested them while babysitting. He babysat Catherine almost every Friday night for several months in early 1999 while the mother worked. He also babysat Alexis in the early afternoon in the latter half of 1999, also while the mother worked. So the mothers both thought of him as an extremely helpful, very child-friendly person. Unfortunately, the girl alleged that he had begun molesting them while he babysat. Now, the primary witnesses, as in most cases of sexual abuse, were the girls, although the defendant had made some incriminating statements to the police, and the victim's family had claimed to have found child pornography in a room in which the defendant had stayed. The allegations by Catherine included molestation in the bedroom, bathroom, and living room of the small apartment where she would visit her mother on weekends with her two brothers. The acts included oral sex, both of the victim by the defendant and the defendant by the victim, digital penetration, penetration with an object, and penile penetration. The penetration with an object that she alleged was a small piece of intravenous tubing that the defendant had allegedly brought from a warehouse where he worked, a medical supply warehouse. The second victim, Alexis, alleged less serious molestation, fondling of the chest and vaginal area. It was clear from Catherine's testimony that if her allegations were true, the defendant would start with less serious forms of abuse and then progressively move to the more serious forms. Again, something that is very typical in sexual abuse cases. The jury acquitted the defendant of all charges. Now, this is not terribly unusual. Although most cases end up in a plea, the cases that go to trial end up in acquittal about 25% of the time. Here's the defense attorney. He countered with the usual defense in child abuse cases. Usual because these elements are typical in most cases of alleged sexual abuse. First, he pointed out that there was no physical evidence. Now, this is true most of the time in cases that we know to be true. Abuse usually leads no permanent physical signs, particularly in cases like this where the alleged abuse is progressive so that the defendant doesn't do anything violent to the child. Second, he argued that the adults in the case were vindictive. The family of the two girls testified, including talking about finding this child pornography. They could barely contain their anger on the stand, and the defense attorney was able to point to this anger, suggesting other motives for the allegations, and suggesting that the child pornography was evidence that they had planted because they wanted to get the defendant. Third, he referred to the repeated interviewing of the girls. Again, this is something that's quite typical. Researchers have found that most children in child sexual abuse cases, at least those tried in criminal court, have been interviewed over 10 times by the time they get to court. The attorney suggested that the children's information may have been due to tainting by biased interviewers. Of course, again, as is typical, there were no videotapes, no audio tapes, no transcripts of these early interviews with the girls. Finally, the defense attorney argued that the girls were lying, that they had conspired with each other to get Alex in trouble. One of the jurors, after the acquittal, explained why they acquitted Alex.
We had to find him guilty all 100%. Guilty without a reasonable doubt. And there was just no reason and not enough evidence to prove Alex guilty. We all 12 walked out of there 100% feeling we did justice. We let an innocent man go.
Juror number 9 also provided a number of reasons why the jury didn't believe the children's story. One of the reasons concerned the nature of the children's answers.
They weren't consistent on their story. We know that they were young, and we understand that they're children, but the story was like, did he touch you 3 times? Yes. Did he touch you 5 times? Yes. Did he touch you 50 times? Yes. Everything was yes, yes, yes.
Now, it's worth stopping for a moment to consider the juror's argument. Surely the juror is right in focusing on the children's testimony. After all, the children are the most important witnesses in the case. They're eyewitnesses to the alleged abuse. And this is almost always the case in child sexual abuse. It's also often the case in other types of crimes, typically crimes that occur in the home, because it's mom, dad, and the kids. So if there's a violent crime where the mother is allegedly abused, or homicide cases where the mother is killed, children are often the only witnesses. And surely, whether the kids are consistent, whether they're credible, whether their answers are complete, is extremely important. But why weren't the children consistent and complete in their responses? Here's where I think we make a mistake. We assume that it has something to do with the child and the truthfulness of the child's story. where if we look closely at the transcript and we think about the way that we question kids, we'll find that the real reason for children in being incomplete is not their youthfulness, not necessarily their fears, but the kinds of questions that we ask them. If we ask children better questions, we can get better answers. And this is true even if the children are afraid or often reluctant to disclose abuse. What we're going to focus on initially is the kinds of questions we ask children, because it's really hard for interviewers to keep track of the form of their questions. They're thinking about content, they're not thinking about form. And researchers have found that we often forget the form of the question that we ask. So we have to think about it ahead of time and plan carefully. We're going to talk about open-ended and WH questions, yes, no, and forced choice questions, tag and suppositional questions. And we'll see why open-ended questions are good, yes, no, and forced choice questions not so good, and tag and suppositional questions clearly bad. Now, pretty much everybody knows that we shouldn't ask tag and suppositional questions. You might not know what those are right now, but as soon as I show you what they are, you'll say, oh yes, yes, yes. I'm told all the time to avoid those questions, and I never ask leading questions. The problem is that simply telling you don't ask leading questions doesn't get you to avoid the questions that I think are most problematic, and that's going to be the yes, no, and forced choice questions. So we're going to focus on those. But first, let's consider those suggestive questions. What are suggestive questions? Well, there's several types. One type is tag questions. Tag questions are questions that contain a little tag, like didn't he, which make it very clear what the interviewer wants to hear. So if you were to ask a child, he touched you, didn't he? You'd be strongly suggesting your bias. And it turns out that young children are susceptible to this sort of suggestion. Even worse than tag questions are what we call suppositional questions. Now my favorite example is a famous question. When did you stop beating your wife? Notice that it's hard to say, I never beat my wife. It presupposes a fact, a crucial fact, that is essentially an allegation. Presupposing information makes a question suppositional. The potential problem is that sometimes suppositional questions look like open-ended questions. They look like good questions. Notice that when did you stop beating your wife is a WH question, right? It's asking for information. It's not assuming information. But because WH questions often embed supposed information, we're going to even want to avoid them and move towards the most open-ended approach possible. Yes-no questions. What's that? Well, it's pretty easy to define, and you probably already know. It's a question that can be answered yes or no. If the child seems like they're answering your questions, but they're doing this and this, you know what that means? You're asking yes-no questions. Ironically, you may feel like you're getting lots of good information from the child, and you might be, but as we'll see, you also are likely to be getting a lot of inaccurate information. What you want to look for is head nods, or in your questions, you want to look for words like did or was, or can you tell me? I'm going to be telling you to ask lots of tell me more questions, but can you tell me is a yes-no question, and it's very easy when you ask a can you tell me question for the child to say no. And finally, do you know? Problematic for lots of reasons, but the reason we'll focus on is the fact that it's a yes-no question and children will often simply answer no. So these are the problems with yes-no questions. First of all, there's the problem of yes biases. Very young children are often yay-sayers. They'll say yes, particularly if they don't even know what you're talking about. So in one study, little children were asked questions like, El Camino Real? And most kids said yes, obviously not having any idea what the interviewer was saying. Children often have no biases, and this may be even more problematic for children who have been abused, because no biases tend to occur when children are asked questions about unpleasant events. They have a simple rule: just say no. Another problem is guessing. Children will rarely say, I don't know, particularly in response to yes-no questions. It's just too easy for the child to choose one of the two responses. Perhaps most important, and often neglected by interviewers, is that even if children's answers to yes-no questions are entirely accurate, they are still not going to lead to as much information as other kinds of questions because children will not elaborate on their responses. Now, one thing to notice is, next time you talk to anybody, stop and think about what form of questions you're asking. It turns out that in talking to adults, we also ask lots of yes-no questions. But adults tend to elaborate. So if I say to my wife, did you go shopping today? and the answer is no, she's likely to say, no, I stayed at home because I had a bunch of errands to do. Or if I say, did you go to shopping today? She might say, no, because I had a doctor's appointment. She'll explain her response and thus elaborate on what she's telling me. If I say to my daughter, did you go shopping today? She's likely to simply say no. And then what I'm forced to do is come up with another hypothesis, another possibility about things she might have done. And you end up asking a series of yes-no questions with very little information coming from the child. What are forced choice questions? Forced choice questions are really easy to spot if you use an or. For example, was it inside or outside? That's a forced choice question. Why are forced choice questions a bad idea? Well, just like there's a yes and no bias with yes and no questions, there's a last item bias with forced choice questions. Children often tend to choose the last given response, particularly if they don't know the answer. So if I say, was it inside or outside, and the child has no clue, she's likely to say outside. I think I'm getting good information, but I'm really just getting garbage. Now, this is actually not just a problem with kids. Phone surveyors know that adults will tend to prefer the last option. It's the one they remember the best, and so they alternate the order of their questions. Interestingly, there's a first option bias if you're thinking about written surveys or ballots. That's why we alternate the order in which the options appear. Another problem with forced choice questions is the same as with yes-no. Kids are reluctant to say, I don't know, and a forced choice question makes it very easy for them to guess. An overlooked problem is that sometimes neither choice is correct. An example of this would be a forced choice question that's often asked in sexual abuse investigations. Were your clothes on or off? The problem with this is that clothes are often neither completely on nor completely off when sexual abuse occurs. But because kids will choose a response and not elaborate on that response, you'll get a very distorted picture of the actual act if you ask a forced choice question. Now, some interviewers say, well, I simply asked the child, was it inside or outside or somewhere else, and I solved that problem. The problem is we have no research to tell us whether this is a good or bad way to proceed. It's giving the child 3 options now instead of 2, which is inherently complicated. And it may be that young children simply choose one of the explicit options that we give them. We just don't know. And that brings us to the best kinds of questions. WH questions are generally familiar to people. You know about who, what, where, when, how, something that you're taught, say, if you ever learn how to write an article for a newspaper. Now, how questions might not seem like a WH question because the W comes at the end, but they are. The point of WH questions is that they do not suggest information as strongly as yes-no questions. But even WH questions have that problem I mentioned earlier, that they are often suppositional. We may presuppose information and build it into a WH question. Another problem with WH questions is they often are very specific. So if I say, how old are you, or what grade are you in, they don't elicit lots of information, just the information that I've specifically requested. The questions I most want to teach you about are questions that you might not be using. In fact, if you're a typical interviewer, you use these questions only about 1% of the time. These are tell me more questions. These are questions where you say to the child, you said X, something the child has just said to you. Tell me more about X. It turns out that all you have to do is give the child information they've given you, give it back to them, ask them to elaborate. What happened next questions are pretty familiar to everybody. Child tells you about something and you say, what happened next? Again, though, it's important to say, you said X, what happened next? To clarify to the child where in the sequence of events you want the child to go. So here's the advice that the 10-step interview takes advantage of. You ask open-ended questions. You ask tell me questions and what happened next questions, and you stick to the WH questions when you need further details. You're going to avoid yes-no questions using did or was or can you tell me or the dreaded or. It's going to be tough, right? Because you're going to have to monitor what kind of questions you're asking. And inevitably, you will ask a yes, no, or forced choice question. Now, I don't want you to kill yourself over this. If you do ask a forced choice question or a yes, no question, the simple solution is to ask a follow-up that is not leading and not closed-ended. So if you end up asking to the child, did he say anything? And the child says yes, the obvious next question is, what did he say? Does it work? Researchers have known for years that tell me more styles of relating to children. In fact, simply repeating information they give us back to them increases the elaborativeness of children's responses. This has really never been controversial. The controversial issue is that many people, including myself, have felt that yes-no questions are often necessary to get at details that children would not otherwise provide. Now, this is true to some extent, but something that research on children actually interviewed about sexual abuse has clearly demonstrated is that tell me more and what happened next questions produce far more details per question than yes, no, and forced choice questions. And because this is hard for people to believe, typically interviewers say, you might be able to get some results in the lab with non-abused kids, but I deal with kids who are afraid and embarrassed to talk, and they're not going to give me responses to these tell me more questions. So I want to tell you about a study that was done by Michael Lamb and his colleagues at the National Institute of Child Health and Development. As I've mentioned, they're the people who invented the structured protocol that the 10th step is derived from. And what they did is they examined about 150 videotaped forensic interviews of children disclosing sexual abuse. Now what they found for the young children, 4 and 5-year-olds, very young kids, is that they would give about 2 details, average, for a yes, no, or a forced choice question. They gave over twice as much information if asked a tell me more question. Even very young children can respond to the tell me more question. What about the older kids? These are 8 and 9-year-olds. Well, they gave about the same number of details as the younger kids did when asked yes, no, and forced choice questions. But when asked the tell me questions, the tell me more, and what happened next questions, they produced 4 times as much information per question. Now, something really interesting to notice is that if asked a yes-no question, an 8 or 9-year-old child looks like a 4 and 5-year-old child. Now think about Catherine and Alexis, 9 years of age, on the stand, trying to convince the jury of serious charges of sexual abuse, but if asked yes-no questions, looking like 4 and 5-year-olds. Recall what the juror said about the reason that the jury decided to acquit.
Did he touch you 3 times? Yes. Did he touch you 5 times? Yes. Did he touch you 50 times? Yes. Everything was yes, yes, yes.
Now let me describe a couple of objections that interviewers have made when I've talked to them about these techniques. One objection is children are reluctant to disclose abuse. Now, I want to tell you, I totally agree with this problem. In my view, if we were to take a representative group of abused kids and bring them in and give them a forensic interview, over half would deny that they were ever abused. The real world, though, is different than that. We don't randomly select children for interviewing. What we do is we wait for signs to arise that a child has been abused. For that reason, most of the children who we interview in forensic interviews are children who have disclosed some sort of abuse in the past. And although they may be embarrassed, they are not as reluctant to disclose as we might initially believe. Another problem is that if we take the assumption that children are reluctant, that doesn't then automatically allow us to ask leading and suggestive questions. Leading and suggestive questions are a terrible idea, no matter if the child is abused or not. If the child was abused and we ask highly leading questions, we're likely to undermine the credibility of the child in case anybody ever watches that interview. And even if we don't videotape in order to protect ourselves against defense attacks, we are likely to taint the child's information. Even a true report can start to look false if we use lots of leading and suggestive questions to insert our own prejudices and assumptions about what occurred to the child. Finally, let's remember that it was the assumptions of reluctance on the behalf of children that led to the daycare disasters of the 1980s and the 1990s. We have to be very careful about assuming reluctance because it can lead us to force a non-abused child into making a disclosure that is not true. A second question that a lot of interviewers ask me is, aren't some details lost unless you ask direct questions? Aren't there certain things that kids are particularly embarrassed to hear or to talk about and that aren't going to respond to unless you ask them specifically? It turns out that with a little thought, a non-leading alternative is usually available. After you introduce yourself to the child, a good first step is to give the child instructions on what an interview is all about. This might seem kind of odd because we interact with kids all the time. But if you think about it, a forensic interview is very unlike most interactions that kids have with adults. In most situations, kids need to know the answer, and adults know the answer. And adults' questions are a tricky means of teaching the child what the answer should be. Imagine a child goes to school and the teacher says, "Billy, what's 5 times 4?" Do you think the child says to himself, "Gee, this teacher doesn't really know her multiplication tables"? Of course not. He knows that the teacher knows and that the teacher expects him to figure out what the answer is. The child guesses, he looks around for help. Anybody knows but him. The problem with that kind of logic is that if a child goes into a forensic interview and thinks that the interviewer is the kind of expert that a teacher or an adult or a parent is, that child can easily fall sway to the interviewer's suggestions. And that's what creates really serious problems for forensic interviews. So you've got to teach the child that a forensic interview is one of those situations in which the child knows the answers, the interviewer doesn't know the answers, and that it's very important to avoid mistakes that might come about because of the child guessing or not knowing the answer to a question. And that's the source of interview instructions. The first benefit of interview instructions is that we know it increases children's accuracy. And everything I'm going to talk about today is based on research that has shown that these instructions improve children's performance. Another benefit is that instructions can reduce children's inclination to guess. Now, one of the things that we've talked about before is the fact that if children don't know the answer to a question, they sometimes go ahead and venture a possibility, particularly if it's a closed-ended question where it's easy to simply guess yes or no or choose one of a forced choice. This is a big problem because if the child is guessing, you're going to get garbage, and instructions can help to reduce that. A third benefit is that instructions can increase children's willingness to ask for clarification. One of the great benefits of instruction is that if a child doesn't understand a question, the instructions will help the child to realize it's okay to say, "I don't understand." And finally, instructions increase children's resistance to suggestion. Now, I'm going to say this and say this again. Instructions are not a panacea. You can ask a highly leading question and get a bad answer, even if you've given the child instructions. But to the extent that you occasionally slip into a question that might be construed as leading, a child who's been given instructions is less likely to fall sway to that suggestion, and therefore less likely to be tainted by your questions. Let's review the different types of instructions. There's going to be a don't know instruction, which tells the child it's okay to say, "I don't know." There's the don't understand instruction, which tells the child it's okay to say, "I don't understand." There's the "you're wrong" instruction, which allows the child to correct the interviewer. Kids love this one. The fourth is the ignorant interviewer instruction, which tells the child that you don't know the answers to your questions. The fifth is promise to tell the truth, where you ask the child to make a guarantee that they'll be honest. There are problems with instructions, and we want to be real clear about it because a lot of interviewers will tell me, "Oh, I already give kids instructions. This is not a problem, this is not something new." And it's not new. What's new is that instructions are so often improperly given in such a way that they're totally ineffective. Well, how can they be ineffective? It's really important that instructions only be given one at a time. You have to go slowly and methodically through the instructions or else the child won't understand what you're trying to instruct them to do. They need to be easy to understand, right? The worst thing is to tell the child it's okay to say, "I don't understand," if they don't know what understand means. So you have to use language that's understandable to even the youngest child. And this is perhaps most important and the most likely thing to be lacking in people's instructions given currently, is you have to give them with feedback. You can't simply tell a child that it's okay to say, "I don't know." You have to give them an example. If you don't, the instruction isn't going to be effective. Let's start with the don't know instruction. I'm going to tell you exactly how to give the instruction. Now, you might feel uncomfortable with this. You might say, "Well, I really like to wing it. I like to use ad-libs. I like to do it my own way." The problem with doing it your own way is that it's very easy to slip into language that young children won't understand. It's very easy to say too much and to spend too much time on instructions. So I'm going to give you the exact language that you can learn, and once you've gotten used to it, once you've practiced it, rehearsed it, it becomes part of your natural repertoire. Okay, here's the exact wording of the don't know instruction. If I ask you a question and you don't know the answer, then just say, "I don't know." Now, if you just did that, what do you suppose would happen? Well, we know what would happen because researchers have tried this instruction in a number of different studies, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't have any effect on kids at all. You're saying, well, why are you telling me to do this? Well, what researchers immediately realized was that this kind of instruction goes in one ear and out the other, unless you give the child an example that they can answer. So we say, so if I ask you, what is my dog's name, what do you say? Give the child some time. Because what you'll see in a lot of children is this look of consternation, of unease, of uncertainty. They'll look at you and say, I don't know. And immediately you say, yes, because you don't know if I have a dog. So you reinforce that. Well, what do you suppose happens now? What did researchers find when they gave kids this instruction? It turns out that if you only give them reinforcement for saying, I don't know, they decide I don't know is a great answer to every question. And they say, I don't know too much. So you have to give them another example. You say, but what if I ask you, do you have a dog? And the child will tell you. Now, one of the things to notice about this instruction is it's fun, right? It's innocuous. You're talking about dogs. Kids often enjoy telling you about their dog. It's rapport building, but it's rapport building with the specific purpose of teaching the child that it's okay to say, I don't know. Let me give you a couple examples of how not to give the don't know instruction. These are actual court cases, cases in which children testified as to child sexual abuse. If you don't know the answer to a question, I don't want you to guess. I just want you to tell us if you don't understand or you don't know the answer, okay? The child says, okay. What's wrong with that instruction? It combines don't know, don't understand, don't guess, doesn't give any feedback. We know from research it's not going to have any beneficial effect for the child. Let me give you another example of how not to give the don't know instruction. Here the judge says, okay, if you don't know the answer to the question, just say you don't know. Just tell her you don't know. And what does the 5-year-old say? I don't know. Clearly, if you don't give the child feedback, if you don't give them an example, you're not really teaching them much. The second instruction is the don't understand instruction. And here's how it goes. If I ask you a question and you don't know what I mean or what I'm saying, you can say, I don't know what you mean. And I'll ask it in a different way. Okay, now stop right here. Why don't we just say, if I ask you a question and you don't understand, say, I don't understand. Well, it turns out that until kids are 5 or so, they don't know what the word understand means. So you might as well be saying to them, if I ask you a question and you don't tell me I don't It's not going to have any effect. So using the exact language that we're teaching you is a good thing because we've avoided those sorts of silly problems. What's the second problem with this? If we stopped here, what would happen? Absolutely nothing. You've got to give them an example. So here's an example that we use. So if I ask you, what is your gender? What do you say? Out of 100 kids at the LAC-USC Medical Center, who we tried this interviewer out with, 2 of the children, 2 12-year-old girls, said female. 98 kids stopped and said, what's gender? You reinforce that. You say, okay, because gender is a hard word, so I'll ask it in a different way. Are you a boy or a girl? And the child will tell you. Now, what do you do about those 2 girls who know that female is the technical term for what their gender is? Well, you obviously have to come up with something else that they don't understand. And what I've been using is, I say to the child, what if I ask you, what is my orientation? What do you say? And the child looks a little puzzled, a little uncertain. I know some of you are probably uncertain yourself. And then I tell them the answer. I say, well, what I mean is, am I standing up or sitting down? And then the child understands. Okay? How not to give the don't understand instruction. Here's another judge. If you don't understand something, say so and we will explain it to you, okay? Is that yes? And the child says yes. Okay. All right, now the child's ready to go. The clerk comes in and says, can you please state your name and spell the last name for the record, please? And the child says, huh? The clerk replies, can you please state your name and spell the last name for the record, please? If you give the don't understand instruction, you have to be willing to put your money where your mouth is. If the child clearly shows incomprehension, or if you think they may not understand a question, make sure that you stop, rephrase, clarify. Ensure that the child understands what you're saying, because incomprehension will often lead to incorrect answers. Next instruction. That's wrong instruction. And as I said before, kids love this instruction. Sometimes I make mistakes or say the wrong thing. When I do, you can tell me that I am wrong. Got to give him an example. So you say, so if I say you are 30 years old, what do you say? Now kids love this. They'll laugh, they'll say, no, I'm not 30 years old. And you say, okay, so how old are you? Now one of the things you might have noticed about all of these instructions is that we're equalizing the power between the interviewer and the child. The reason why kids like this instruction is so much is we're coming down to the level of the child. And we actually know from research that literally matters. The level at which we're talking to the child matters. Researchers have found that, if you're the adult like this and you're standing up and you're talking to the child and the child's like this, the child is more suggestible if you're standing up when you're asking them questions. And if you simply take the time to come down to the child's eye level, you minimize suggestibility. And what all of these instructions are doing, if you think about it, is bringing the interviewer down to the child's level. The interviewer is saying, I'm going to talk at your level of language, I'm going to ask questions that you understand, and as you'll see in the next instruction, the interviewer is saying, and I don't know any more than you do. In fact, the child is the real expert in the forensic interview. The ignorant interviewer instruction is the shortest, and actually I didn't believe it worked. Didn't seem to me it would work until I saw a study that I'll tell you about in a moment. The reason I didn't think it would work is it doesn't give any reinforcement, it doesn't give any examples. It's just this simple. I don't know what's happened to you. I won't be able to tell you the answers to my questions. The next instruction is promise to tell the truth. And here's exactly how you want to say it. It's very important that you tell me the truth. Do you promise that you will tell me the truth? Are you going to tell me any lies? Now here, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to use the exact language, and let me explain to you why. Why do you suppose that we say, do you promise that you will tell me the truth? Why don't we just say, do you promise to tell the truth? Turns out that maltreated kids that we've actually tested in court, don't understand the word promise until they're 6 years of age. So for younger kids, you're not asking them to do anything at all. Kids at this young age do, however, understand the word will. So when you say, do you promise that you will, you're making sure that even the youngest child can understand what you're asking them to do. What about, are you going to tell me any lies? Why do we say that? Well, we tried out this child-friendly version of the oath, and what we found is that when we ask kids, do you promise that you won't tell me any lies? A third of the kids said no. Now what do you suppose? Do you suppose the kids are saying, no, I don't promise? Or do you suppose the kids are confused by a sentence with two negative phrases? Do you promise that you won't tell any lies? Or rather, I should say, do you promise, which is an affirmative, that you won't, which is a negative? And kids often will say no, because what they're really saying is, I'm not going to lie. And that's why we reworded the instruction to explicitly ask them whether they're going to tell us lies. Okay? Exact words count. Use this phrase. Use it again and again. And it will seem natural to you. It will no longer seem like you're following a script, but you'll be ensuring that even the youngest children can understand what you're doing. Now at this point, let me say just a word about people's concerns, because a lot of interviewers are taught that they need to ask kids what the meaning of truth and lies is. Well, why don't I teach that? There are actually very simple ways of getting at this understanding, but the instructions I'm teaching you here are instructions that we know increase children's accuracy. And it turns out that testing children's understanding of the meaning of truth and lies doesn't have any relationship to their accuracy. And in fact, what we've recently found is that eliciting a promise to tell the truth increases accuracy in kids, even those kids who don't seem to understand the words truth and lie. Well, how does that make any sense? What's likely happening is that we're not very good at assessing kids' understanding of the words. So some kids will fail the vocabulary test, but still understand what a promise means and still be more compliant as a result of a promise. So for that reason, we don't teach you as part of the instructions a test for truth and lies. You just ask for a promise to tell the truth, and that should suffice. Do these instructions work? As I've already said several times, I'm only teaching you about instructions that have been proven by research to have a positive effect on kids. And like I said to you before, I want to give you an example of the one that surprised me the most, and this is that simple, ignorant interviewer instruction. Mulder and Virch did a study in 1996, typical lab study, where they exposed kids to the same situation. They know exactly what happens. It's a lady and a man interacting. It's a little bit argumentative, but they don't do anything really seriously violent. You can't for obvious ethical reasons. They then ask the kids a number of questions, but three of which are highly leading, suppositional questions. The questions were this: who threw the book across the classroom? Well, nobody threw the book. What color were the woman's glasses? Well, the woman wasn't wearing glasses. And how hard did the woman hit the man on the head? Well, she didn't hit him on the head. As you can imagine, these would be very leading, suggestive questions that would lead to lots of inaccurate information if you were to use them in a forensic interview. What's interesting is the fact that kids, both in the younger group, who we know of as more suggestible, and the older group, who we tend to think as less suggestible, perform terribly on these questions. As you can see, the accuracy rates are only 40%, which means more than half the time kids complied with the presupposition in these questions. Simply telling the child, I don't know what's happened to you, improved children's performance for both younger and older children. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons. For us, the main point to take home is that clearly a large part of the reason why kids are so suggestible to highly leading questions is that assumption they make that we know what's happened to them. So when we put our guess into a question, they think that that guess is reality. Note that even the younger kids benefit by an instruction, and that this suggests a reason why kids succumb to suggestive questions, because they think the interviewer knows what happened to them. That makes them more suggestible. And finally, and this might be most important to people who worry about suggestibility, note that even with the instruction, kids are not anywhere near 100% in answering these questions. They're still very suggestible. And for that reason, as I'll reiterate time and time again, a bad interview or suggestive interview will wash out any positive effects that instructions might have. Okay, so review. I don't know instruction. Don't understand instruction. You're wrong instruction. Promise to tell the truth, and the ignorant interviewer instruction. Now, as you can see, I got the last two out of order, and I got to tell you something. No matter how many interviews I've done, I still go into every interview with the 10-step interview on my lap. I still have a script of what I'm going to say to the child when I start. And part of the reason is I just don't remember very well. Part of the reason is that I understand how important it is to get the exact wording down. And part of the reason is that I'm often nervous when I start an interview. And if I know exactly what I'm going to be saying to the child for the first 4 or 5 minutes, then that helps me to become relaxed so that I can do a good job when we get to the substantive part, to the disclosure part of the interview. Okay, now, let me warn you again that instructions are not a cure-all. And here's some of the limitations. The first is that they don't work so well with younger kids. Kids younger than 5 or so often not only don't understand questions, but don't know when they don't understand, right? They don't have the insight to realize that a question is incomprehensible to them. Obviously, the don't understand instruction is not going to work so well for those kids. A second problem, and I've mentioned this before, and I can't emphasize it enough, is that suggestive interviewing overrides the benefits of instructions. The most important thing for you to do in your forensic interview is to avoid highly leading questions. That's the best thing you can do. And the last, and this isn't necessarily a limitation, is that efficacy is only tested in the lab. Now, the good thing about this is that we know what the truth is, and that's how we can say with confidence that instructions increase accuracy. The downside is we don't know how effective instructions are with kids in real-world abuse interviews. So it may be the case, for example, that children are more resistant to saying, I don't understand, when they know that the stakes are very high and what they're being questioned about. And for that reason, we have to be just a little skeptical about how effective instructions are going to be. Nevertheless, it's a good start, and when you combine it with the other aspects of the structured interview, you'll definitely do a better job of interviewing young kids. Just about every interviewer knows that it's important to try to build rapport with the child before getting into the real guts of an interview. It's probably not a good strategy to sit down, say, with a child who's witnessed a homicide and say, okay, tell me about, how your mom got killed by your dad. That's just not a good interviewing strategy. So everybody knows you should build rapport. What a lot of people are unsure about is what is the best way to build rapport. The unfortunate thing about the way we interact with children is that a lot of times we're building rapport by doing all the talking. This is what will happen if you ask Lots of yes, no, and closed-ended questions. So if you ask things like, do you like school? What grade are you in? How old you are? You're going to get the child talking, but the child will only be talking a little bit. And that's because you're asking yes, no, and closed-ended questions. I've seen a lot of rapport building when the interviewer is doing all the talking and the child is merely nodding her head or shaking her head. And although you might feel as if you're building rapport, what you're really doing is just shutting the child down. What narrative practice will teach you how to do is to build rapport at the same time that you're practicing a new kind of interaction with kids, one that they're often not accustomed to. An interaction where the interviewer is actually saying very little and the child is providing elaborated narrative responses. Let me give you an overview of the narrative practice procedure. It's really very simple. First, you're going to ask the child about things he or she likes to do and things he or she doesn't like to do. And you're going to practice the tell me more prompt. Now, the tell me more prompt is going to be the most important thing you learn about interviewing. It is the question that you will be able to rely on most of the time in most of your interviews for most of your information. Because what the tell me more prompt does is simply gives back to the child what the child has given you and asks the child to tell me more. It's going to be, child says something, you say, oh, you like basketball? Tell me more about basketball. And this tell me more prompt will be the prompt that you will use most often in a good interview. You'll also ask the child about a recent event. Now, what I'll suggest is that you ask them about your last birthday, but it doesn't have to be their last birthday. It can be some recent event. Here you'll practice the what happened next prompt, which is a very simple, you had a piñata, you got presents, you said you got a cake, tell me what happened next. And it allows the child to tell you about events in a sequence. The importance of the birthday narrative practice is that most of the things that we ask kids about are about narratives, about events that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's a good idea to practice that with the child before you move to the narrative that is of most concern. So the first question you say for the narrative practice is the like to do question. First, I'd like you to tell me something about things you like to do. That's all you have to say. What you do have to learn to do, and what is difficult for many anxious interviewers, is to wait for the child to respond. Now, teachers learn about this. They learn about something called wait time. And this came about because something that educational researchers noticed when they went into the classroom is that some children were underperforming because teachers weren't giving them enough time to respond. So remember that Billy kid. Billy goes to school, teacher says, Billy, what's 5 times 4? Billy's on the spot. He's got to answer. He's got to come up with it. He's thinking, okay, wait, 5. Do I do the 5s tables or do I do the 4s tables? And before Billy can spit out the answer, the teacher says, Jamie. Jamie says 20. Billy's destined for failure, right? The problem is, and this is something that teachers learn, is that when you ask a child a question, you have to recognize that children will take longer to process the information that you're giving them. You've got to give them some time. Now, I've seen wait time, I think wait time is a particularly significant problem when we're dealing with children who we assume may be embarrassed or afraid or feel guilty about what they're disclosing. Silences feel uncomfortable to us. And so even though the child may be fully willing to give a response, may be gathering her thoughts, we often swoop in with a more direct question when a less direct question doesn't seem to be effective. Here's a chance for you to pause and give the child as much time as they need. And in some ways to tell the child you really do want them to give you a response to this open-ended question. As soon as the child gives you any kind of information, you move to the tell me more prompt. So, child says soccer. A one-word response is all you need to start building the narrative. You said you like to play soccer. Tell me more about playing soccer. Here is, again, the most important question you learn to do. You said soccer. Tell me more about playing soccer. Notice that you're not using any words the child might not understand, that you're building on the child's performance, and notice that you're not simply saying, oh, tell me more, or what else, which often leads the child to say nothing. You're focusing in on something that the child has given you, and you're asking the child to expand it. And that's the basic structure of a good interview, as you'll see. You then want to move to the don't like to do prompt. Now tell me about things you don't like to do. In addition to continuing the narrative practice, what this does is communicates to the child that you'll be talking about both good things and about bad things. And of course, most of the time that we're talking to kids about disclosure of abuse or homicide or domestic violence, we're going to have to be talking about bad things. The follow-up is the same as with tell me about things you like to do. You said you don't like to read books. Tell me more about reading books. One of the things to be careful here is don't be judgmental. I was actually shocked when a little boy told me about not liking to read books, and I started thinking about his failure as an adult if this were so. And I had this impulse to say, don't you like to read books? But notice that you don't want to impose any of your own views on the child. You just want to get the child talking, and you want to be open and accepting to what the child says. After you go through the tell me about things you like to do, tell me about things you don't like to do, then you move to a recent event. Now I call this the birthday question because I typically ask children this. Now tell me about your last birthday. Tell me everything that happened. Here you ask the child about any recent event. It doesn't have to be a birthday. The point is not to talk about birthdays specifically. The point is to get the child to talk about an event that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Because most of the things that we're asking kids questions about in forensic interviews are narratives over time. If the child gives you any information about this birthday or what they did on this particular day, the prompt that you want to practice is the what next prompt. And this is very simple. You said you hit a piñata. What did you do next? Now, as much as possible, you should stick to forward sequence because we know that children naturally tell things in a forward order and that many young children have difficulty moving backwards in time when they're talking about a narrative. What often happens is that you'll ask a child what happened before that, and the child will tell you what happened after, and this can lead to a lot of confusion. So it's best to always move what happened next, if possible. Now, it's true that sometimes kids will cut to the chase. You'll ask them about their birthday, and they'll say, and then we open presents. And if you're like my family, that's the last thing you do on any birthday. Well, what do you do then? How do you ask them if you can't move backwards in time? It turns out that it looks like it's easier for kids to move to the first event. So what you could do with that child is say, well, what's the first thing you did? And then what happened next, what happened next, what happened next? Does it work? When I talked about instructions, I talked about laboratory research, and some interviewers are skeptical about lab research. They say, well, how do we know this will work with abused kids, right? They're a totally different group. They're scared. They're reluctant. I'm not going to be able to get kids to talk. I know how reticent kids are when they've been abused. Well, I know that too. What you should realize is that narrative practice is something that's been proven both in the laboratory and in field research. And it's the field research I want to emphasize because people find this most convincing. I'm going to show you some of the field results so that you'll see just how effective it is to use narrative practice before getting to the disclosure phase of an interview. This was a study done in 1997 by Kathleen Sternberg and her colleagues at the National Institute of Child Health and Development. And as I've said before, they really deserve most of the credit for the structured interview approach. And many of the elements of the 10-step that I teach come from the NICHD structured protocol. What Sternberg and her colleagues were interested in doing was directly testing the possibility that narrative practice would help kids give more information. And what they did is they worked with the Israeli youth investigators. This is a group of specially trained social workers who will interview all the kids in Israel who make any kind of abuse report. And here specifically they were looking at children who had made some sort of sexual abuse report. They watched the youth investigators question kids, and they actually were quite good. They always used rapport building. They always used talk about an innocuous event before they moved to the abuse report. Now these are kids in Israel, they're Jewish, and they were being asked questions for rapport building about what they had done on Hanukkah. The questions tended to be something like this. Did you light candles on the first night of Hanukkah? Did you get presents for Hanukkah? And one thing to notice is those are yes-no questions. And what the kids typically did is would answer yes or no, or they'd name the presents. But their answers were very clipped, very short. So Sternberg did this. They took half the interviewers and they said, we want you to question these kids in a slightly different way. Go ahead and ask them about Hanukkah. That's great. That's rapport building. But do it as a narrative practice. So ask the kids questions like, what did you do for Hanukkah? And if the child says, we got presents, say, oh, you got presents. Tell me more about the presents. The child said, we light candles, or we lit candles. Say, oh, tell me what happened next. The researchers then had all the interviewers, right, both in the group of open-ended rapport building and also in the direct introduction style, had all of them ask a question to elicit a potential abuse report. And this question was, I understand that something may have happened to you. Please tell me everything that happened from the very beginning to the very end. The fact that this elicited abuse reports probably surprises you, because notice it doesn't say anything about abuse. It's very indirect. And we're going to talk about that more later when we talk about how to get to the disclosure phase of an interview. But what I want you to focus on is what happened next, right? What happened after the interviewer asked that very open-ended question? What you find with the younger children is that even using the direct introductory style, which is pretty closed-ended, they still produced a lot of details in their first report of abuse, over 20. What the researchers found is that if the interviewers adopted the open-ended introductory style, if they used narrative practice, children produced more details, reliably more details. The effects were particularly remarkable for the older kids, 9 and older. These kids provided over 40 details about abuse in their very first response to the abuse-related question. If these kids were given narrative practice, they produced an average of 140 details in their very first report of abuse. Narrative practice works. It increases the number of details that children provide, and this is looking at the number of details before the interviewer asked any subsequent questions about abuse. Well, you can tell I feel pretty strongly about this. The reason is that I think that we underestimate children's performance, and that we most underestimate children's performance in that older group who most benefited from narrative practice. Let me go back to an example that I introduced earlier in the training. This is the case of Alex A., the criminal case in which the 2 girls testified, Catherine and Alexis, and Alex was acquitted. Here's what happened when Catherine first took the stand. The prosecutor in that case was actually quite good, and he understood that it would be easier on Catherine if he spent some time talking about things other than the sexual abuse that Catherine had alleged against Alex. You can imagine that narrative practice is probably even something more necessary to do in court, because the child has to take the stand, they're in front of the jury, they're in front of the defendant, there's the judge. It's a scary environment for anybody, particularly a young child. Here's what happened. Are you on Christmas break right now? Yes. When do you have to go back to school? January 2nd. Are you looking forward to going back? Yeah. How come? Because I miss going to school. Do you like school? Yes. What's your favorite subject? Do you have a class you like the best? I like art. You like art? Yes. Well, stop and look at that for a second. And you can get a feel for how much Catherine is talking and how much the attorney is talking if you remove the attorney's words. What you see is that Catherine is doing very little talking. So although the attorney might be calming down, the attorney might be warming up, it's not clear that Catherine is. And also note that to the extent that the attorney is hoping that the jury will get to know Catherine, get to understand her, get to have a feel for her language patterns, her development, her personality, it's really pretty lacking because we just aren't hearing much from Catherine. Now let's look at the questions that the attorney asks. What kind of questions are these, and why aren't they being productive? Well, if we go back to our classification, we'll see that most of these questions are yes-no questions. If you ask a child a yes-no question, the child will give you a yes or a no. That doesn't elaborate, that doesn't provide a narrative, it doesn't let the jury get to know the child. Notice that there are a couple of WH questions, which we've said are good questions. The when do you have to go back to school and what's your favorite subject. The problem, though, is these aren't great WH questions because they're asking for very specific details. In fact, the when do you have to go back to school question is potentially disastrous because I know that my 13-year-old on Christmas break would have no idea when she's going back to school. And so this would merely make the child feel like you were testing them. The ironic thing, and I see this again and again, is that the most productive question is the shortest question. How come? Right? Why? Which is really, tell me more about that. Unfortunately, the attorney only used it once. Let's review. First of all, ask the child about things he or she likes to do and doesn't like to do. Follow up with tell me more questions. Don't just say, tell me more. Say, you said you like soccer. Tell me more about soccer. Ask the child about a recent event, such as a birthday or what they did this morning, and follow up with what happened next questions. And feel perfectly comfortable mixing what happened next questions with tell me more questions, because that's the way your actual interview will proceed. The most important thing to realize is that you really should build rapport with kids, and that the way you build rapport makes a big difference in how productive the child's ultimate report will be.